we were using them to try to prop up the projector for a minute. They worked really well for that. It's also a really good book. So, Mr. Sullum's weekly column, distributed by Creator Syndicate, is carried by major newspapers across the U.S., including the New York Post, Chicago Sun-Times, etc. He's a frequent guest on TV and radio networks, including Fox News Channel, CNN, and NPR. A fellow of the Knight Center for Specialized Journalism, Mr. Sullum has been a featured speaker at the International Conference on Drug Policy Reform and the Conference on Computers, Freedom, and Privacy. Mr. Sullum has won numerous awards for journalism and investigative reporting. He's a graduate of Cornell University, where he majored in economics and psychology, and he lives right here in Dallas with his wife and 3 daughters. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Jacob Sullum.
Okay, yeah. Let me know if I'm making too little noise or too much noise. I had to manually move all of these slides over, so they're not quite centered. Don't know why, but I'm hoping you'll be at least able to read the text.
My fault, not his. It's the projector.
Something wacky with the projector. So you probably heard Noah. He's best known as the prophet who saved all of humanity along with many lesser animals by building a big ark that saved them from a worldwide flood. He less often gets credit for planting the first vineyard. Perhaps because this great accomplishment was soon followed by an embarrassing episode that illustrated the pitfalls of too much wine. According to Genesis, Noah drank of the wine and became drunk, and he uncovered himself within his tent. Exhibitionism, of course, is not the only side effect of alcohol consumption that has been observed over the years. Using the story of Noah as a springboard, the rabbi suggests that the way people behave under the influence of alcohol depends on the amount they've consumed. When Noah came to plant the vineyard, they said, Satan took a lamb and slaughtered it beneath the vine. Then he took a lion and killed it, followed by a swine and a monkey. He spilled their blood in the vineyard. This signifies that before a man drinks wine, he is simple like a lamb, who doesn't know anything. When a man drinks as is customary, he is bold like a lion, saying there is no one like him in the world. When a man drinks too much, he becomes like a swine, peeing on himself. And when he is drunk, he becomes like a monkey, standing and dancing and acting foolishly, and says inappropriate things in front of everyone, for he does not know what he is doing. Now, depending on the sort of crowd you hang out with, this might have the ring of truth to you. Personally, I think that they got the order of the stages off a little bit, because my feeling is once you're peeing on yourself, it's time to go home. In any case, the rabbis had the notion that dosage was the main cause of these different effects, but that clearly can't be the whole story, because different people behave differently after drinking the same amount. If we tried to catalog all these responses in all their diversity, we might soon run out of animals. For example, some people, not me, find that alcohol stimulates their thinking, while others find that it makes them stupid. There are happy drunks and sad drunks, outgoing drunks and shy drunks, loud drunks and quiet drunks, mean drunks and maudlin drunks, violent drunks and affectionate drunks, amorous drunks and impotent drunks. Even more puzzling, these opposites may be the same people on different occasions. Back in 1969, a psychologist named Craig McAndrew and an anthropologist named Robert Richardson published a book called Drunken Comportment. And they explored all of these different contradictions in the way people behave under the influence of alcohol. With alcohol inside us, they observed, our comportment may change in any of a wondrously profuse variety of ways. How can the conventional conventional understanding of alcohol qua disinhibitor possibly accommodate the fact that even within our own culture, people who have made their bodies alcoholed differ so drastically both within and among themselves in their subsequent doings? How is it that the same man in the same bar, drinking approximately the same amount of alcohol, may on 3 nights running be, say, surly and belligerent on the first evening, the spirit of amiability on the second, and morose and withdrawn on the third? McAndrew and Edgerton pointed out that drunken comportment varies between individuals in the same culture, across situations in the same individual, over time in the same individual, across cultures, across across situations in the same culture and over time in the same society. And their most interesting evidence came from these cross-cultural comparisons where they looked at various societies, including ones in North America and South America, Africa, and Asia. And they cited examples of tribes where people would get falling down drunk without any dramatic changes in demeanor, and others where people would routinely get into bloody fights after drinking. Finland. Just saying. Within the same society, people drinking in a ceremonial context would be peaceful and friendly, while people drinking in a less structured situation would be raucous and violent, even though the amounts consumed were comparable. Andrew and Richardson concluded that drunken comportment is essentially a learned affair. The way people comport themselves when drunk is determined not by alcohol's toxic assault upon the seat of moral judgment, conscience, or the like, but by what their society makes of and imparts to them concerning the state of drunkenness. The psychiatrist Norman Zinberg was making a similar point when he talked about the three main factors that shape a drug's perceived effects. He talked about drug, set, and setting. The drug, that's pretty self-explanatory. The chemistry does matter, but also the set, by which he meant the person's personality, expectations, and emotional state, and the setting, very broadly construed to include the physical, social, and cultural environment. And so some of the societal expectations of how drugs affect people would figure into that. In other words, drugs do not cause behavior. How a person acts after taking a drug is determined by a complex interaction of variables, a process in which the user's beliefs and choices play a crucial role. Although the idea of drug-induced behavior does not fit the facts very well, it remains popular, especially among supporters of the war on drugs. According to voodoo pharmacology, drugs take control of people and force them to sin. People under the influence of drugs do not have a will of their own. They perform as commanded by a chemical that has hijacked their bodies. Because drugs are so powerful, the context in which they're taken is irrelevant. Anyone who uses them can end up being used by them, so even experimenting with them is reckless. All use is abuse, meaning typically, if not inevitably, immoral behavior. Now, sloth is one example of a drug-induced sin that is frequently mentioned. When people talk about the bad effects that drugs can have on you. The lazy, good-for-nothing drunk is a familiar example. Here is one on the sidewalk of the 19th century saloon, and the sign reads, "Specimen of the work done inside." Although most people nowadays recognize that the wino in the gutter is not a typical drinker, the clueless, shiftless pothead is often portrayed as a typical marijuana consumer. The image even has a scientific-sounding name. In 1970, the head of Harvard University's Health Services told Congress, "I am very much concerned about what has come to be called the amotivational syndrome. I'm certain as I can be that when an individual becomes dependent upon marijuana, he becomes preoccupied with it. His attitude changes toward endorsement of values which he had not before. He tends to become very easily satisfied with what is immediately present in such a way that it seems to have been robbed of his ability to make appropriate choices." A decade and a half later, the founding director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse declared that millions of young people are living as shadows of themselves, empty shells of what they could have been and would have been without pot. A motivational syndrome has been portrayed in several ads that are produced by the Partnership for a Drug-Free America, which I think has recently changed its name just to the Partnership at drugfree.org, something like that. They're the people who gave us the "This is your brand on drugs" ads. One TV spot about marijuana shows these two guys in a basement who are smoking pot, and one of them's watching television, and the other one is ridiculing warnings about the dangers of pot. "We've been smoking for 15 years, says the skeptic, and nothing has ever happened to me." Then we hear the voice of his mother asking him if he's looked for a job today. The announcer says, "Marijuana can make nothing happen to you, too." Here's a more recent print ad in a similar vein from the Office of National Drug Control Policy. It shows a pot smoker who says to his dog, "Can't you just watch yourself?" The dog, who evidently is not stoned, says, "You disappoint me," which I guess means the guy should either stop smoking pot or get a less judgmental dog. Despite its continuing appeal as a propaganda theme, the idea that smoking pot makes people unproductive has never been substantiated. In their book, Marijuana Myths, Marijuana Facts, which I highly recommend, it's a very good, concise compendium of refutations of the various myths about marijuana. The sociologist Lynn Zimmer and the pharmacologist John P. Morgan examined the evidence and concluded there is nothing in these data to suggest that marijuana reduces people's motivation to work, their employability, or their capacity to earn wages. Studies have consistently found that marijuana users earn wages similar to or higher than non-users. Back in 1999, there was a government commissioned report from the National Academy of Sciences, which was looking mainly at the medical potential of marijuana, but incidentally looked at the possible side effects, one of which was amotivational syndrome, and this is what they concluded. Amotivational syndrome is not a medical diagnosis, but it has been used to describe young people who drop out of social activity to show little interest in school, work, or other goal-directed activity. When heavy marijuana use accompanies these symptoms, the drug is often cited as the cause, but there are no convincing data to demonstrate a causal relationship between marijuana smoking and these behavioral characteristics. Long before pot smoking became popular among white middle-class adolescents, something that sounded very much like amotivational syndrome was blamed on a different sort of cigarette. The 1904 textbook, Our Bodies and How We Live, matter-of-factly informed students that the honors of the great schools, academies, and colleges are very largely taken by the abstainers from tobacco. The reason for this is plain. The mind of the habitual user of tobacco is apt to lose its capacity for study or successful effort. And this cartoon comes from a book that by Henry Ford. It was published in 1914. It was called The Case Against the Little White Slaver. And it shows Thomas Edison, who was another opponent of cigarette smoking, applying a voltmeter to the head of this little delinquent who was smoking. And you can see, if you look closely, it registers 0. And then the caption says, "Not a live wire." Another example of anti-cigarette propaganda from early in the century is this cartoon from the Women's Christian Temperance Union that shows this boy making his way through life and these various kinds of shoals upon which his boat can be wrecked. One of which, not surprisingly, is labeled alcohol, although it's actually spelled wrong, I just noticed. It says alcohol, but next to it is cigarette, right? Connie Mack, who was a famous, I gather, I don't know much about baseball, I gather he's a pretty famous baseball manager. He said, "No boy or man can expect to succeed in this world to a high position and continue the use of cigarettes." Biologist David Stark Jordan, who was the first president of Stanford University, took a similar view. The boy who smokes cigarettes need not be anxious about his future, he said. He has none. So, like marijuana today, tobacco was said to strip people of the ambition and ability to succeed in school and at work, undermining the conditions essential for prosperity. The parallel suggests that both drugs became symbols of fears that recur in every generation. Apparently somebody just took a turn in word and friends. So another fear that's often associated with drugs is the idea that they will release these uncontrollable sexual impulses. And of course, alcohol's role as an aphrodisiac is widely recognized, and it's not always seen in a sinister light. Obviously, it can be if somebody has sex with someone who is unable to consent, but as a sort of prelude to sex that's pretty widely accepted in this society. And this quip from Ogden Nash, maybe a little offensive today, but not outrageously so. And people still perceive it as a sort of acceptable prelude to sex. But when the drug is one that's less familiar and it's said to be associated with sex, it's always much more threatening to people. So for example, MDMA, also known as ecstasy, is portrayed as a precursor to reckless, regrettable sex at best, and sexual assault at worst. A few years ago, the Chicago Tribune warned parents that wild rave parties lure youngsters into environments loaded with dangerous club drugs, underage drinking, and sometimes predatory sexual behavior. People pay to dance, do drugs, play loud music, and engage in random sex acts. I can provide you with the addresses. Now, it's certainly true that some people have sex after taking MDMA, but the strong connection that's implied by such press reports is inconsistent with the accounts of most users. In their book, The Pursuit of Ecstasy, Marshall Rosenbaum and Jerome Beck conclude that typical MDMA experience is more emotional and sensual than sexual. They quote a psychotherapist who says, MDMA and sex do not go very well together. For most people, MDMA turns off the ability to function as a lover. It's called the love drug because it opens up the capacity to feel loving and affectionate and trusting. Now, if any of you, I don't know if any of you have tried it, I hear that it does have effects that are similar to that, but less sexual, more emotional. The MDMA users I interviewed for my book took a similar view. A retired professor told me, it's just wonderful to bring closeness, intimacy, not erotic intimacy at all, but a kind of spiritual intimacy, a loving relationship, and openness to dialogue that nothing else can quite match. And this is why, obviously, MDMA was used in psychotherapy before it was banned, it continued to be used even after it was banned, and they're trying to bring back that use for everything now. MDMA is by no means the only drug accused of its detractors of inspiring lust. The 19th century anti-tobacco polemicist warned that tobacco eating and deviltry are both one, because the fierce passions of many tobacco chewers, as regards the other sex, are immensely increased by the fires kindled in their systems and, of course, in their cerebellums by tobacco excitement. That sounds like a theme from a cigarette maker. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, anti-opium crusaders popularized this image of the sinister Chinaman who lured white women into his opium den, turning them into concubines, prostitutes, or sex slaves. The San Francisco authorities warned that police have found white women and Chinamen side by side under the effects of this drug, a humiliating sight to anyone who has anything left of manhood. Now, the opium den was a menace because it promoted intimate contact between white women and men of a foreign race. The saloon was a menace because it isolated men from the civilizing influence of women. Under these circumstances, men's aggressive instincts primed by alcohol had free reign. This is an illustration from a book called 10 Nights in a Barroom, which was published in 1860, a very famous, best-selling anti-alcohol tract. And it shows this saintly little girl who comes to fetch her father home from the saloon and happens to come in right at the moment where these two guys are brawling, and one of them throws a tumbler that strikes her in the head, and she eventually dies, but it goes on for quite a while. And so nowadays, people still have this idea of alcohol, that alcohol makes people violent, right? That's a common belief, I think. Or at least it makes some people violent in some circumstances. But again, this kind of charge is always more frightening when it's leveled at a drug that's less familiar to you. Beginning in the 1960s, for example, the tranquilizer, PCP, also known as angel dust, was said to induce feelings of invulnerability, give its users superhuman strength, and cause outbursts of vicious, irrational violence. Robert DuPont, whom we've heard from before, he was the former director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, called PCP a real terror of a drug. Time reported that angel dust has been linked to hundreds of murders, suicides, and accidental deaths. One example it gave was a user in California walked into a house that he had picked at random, killed the baby, and stabbed a pregnant woman in the stomach. Other stories describe the superhuman physical strength and tolerance to pain that PCP precipitates, requiring several police officers to subdue a single man. The transformative powers of PCP had a familiar ring
Sure. Would you care for now, Dr.
to fans of horror movies based on speculative fiction, and of TV shows based on comic books.